Abyss Walker, Chapter 1. The rust of remembrance. The rain in Gallows reached wasn't water. It was the residue of sorrow, a viscous gray that clung to the blackened timbers of the remaining buildings and tasted of regret. It fell with a mournful sigh, mirroring the low, guttural wails that echoed from the valleys. Choked heart the fortress of Lord Haruki, the Cursed Daimyo. I stood on the crest of a rise, Kuro-Taiyo the black sun pressed tight against my arm, the obsidian scales beneath my skin, radiating a cold that seeped deeper than the rain. It wasn't merely a blade, it was a wound, a constant, throbbing reminder of the bargain I'd made. A bargain with a god best described as a void, a being that offered strength in exchange for a piece of my soul, a fragment that now pulsed with the unnatural rhythm of the abyss. The valley itself was a study in decay. Twisted, skeletal trees clawed at the perpetually bruised sky, their branches draped with the gray rain. The air hung thick with the stench of burnt flesh and something else. Something older. Something primal and profoundly wrong. The villagers, those who hadn't already been reduced to living husks, moved with a glazed-eyed emptiness, their limbs moving as if controlled by a puppeteer with a cruel hand. They were soul fuel, meticulously harvested by the daimyo's gravity knights. I hadn't come to save them. Such sentimentality was a weakness I'd purged long ago. I'd come for the silence. The relentless, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic grinding of the gravity knight's armor and the horrifying wet slurping of the daimyo's hunger. The fortress itself was an obscene monument to corruption, a bloated, floating monstrosity tethered to the valley floor by chains of solidified darkness. It wasn't built of stone, it was built of stolen souls. I could feel their despair radiating outwards, a constant, agonizing pulse that threatened to drown me. My boots crunched on the shattered remains of what had once been a market square, a mangled cart, a splintered stall displaying faded silks, and the petrified remains of a merchant, his eyes wide with an eternally silent scream. It wasn't a battlefield, not in the traditional sense. It was a carefully orchestrated nightmare, a slow, agonizing erosion of everything that had once held meaning. A flicker of movement caught my eye. One of the gravity knights, a hulking behemoth clad in plates of blackened steel, was patrolling the perimeter, its movements deliberate and unnervingly smooth. Its face, obscured by a helmet adorned with the skull of a fallen warrior, was impassive, reflecting only the sickly green glow emanating from the fortress above. These knights weren't warriors, they were instruments of consumption, their armor engineered to amplify the void's reach, their purpose to funnel the stolen souls into the daimyo's monstrous core. I didn't engage. Direct confrontation was a distraction. I preferred to observe, to understand the mechanisms of this horrific tableau. The rain intensified, washing away the grime of the valley, but not the stain of the horror. I'd been tracking the gravity knights for 3 days. They were meticulous, almost robotic in their efficiency, but there was an unsettling lack of variation in their patrol routes, a subtle predictability that betrayed a deeper control. That control, I suspected, emanated from Haruki himself. Then I saw it. A young woman, no older than 16, was being dragged towards the fortress, her resistance futile, her face a mask of vacant terror. She was beautiful, even in her captivity. Her dark hair was plastered to her face with rain, and her eyes held a spark of something defiance, perhaps, or simply a desperate plea for mercy. The knight approached, its massive hand reaching out to claim her. Something snapped. Not within me, not entirely. It was a resonance, a sympathetic vibration with the suffering around me. A reflex, brutal and instinctive. I moved. Kuro-Taiyo erupted from my arm, a shard of absolute darkness. The scales pulsed with a violet light as I pulled the blade free, the obsidian scraping against my flesh. It was a movement honed over years of brutal training, a dance of violence perfected in the darkest corners of the world. It wasn't elegant, it was terrifyingly efficient. The night barely registered my arrival. It moved with sickening precision, its hammer raised to crush the girl. I unleashed the event horizon. The air around the night warped, the very geometry of the valley twisting as the void drew in. The steel of its armor shimmered, then imploded, collapsing inwards on itself in a vortex of gray light. The night screamed a choked, agonizing sound that was immediately swallowed by the rain. The girl, momentarily free from the night's grasp, stared in stunned silence at the wreckage, her eyes reflecting the sickly green glow of the fortress. The rain, however, didn't stop. It continued to fall, washing away the blood and the dust, but never the memory. And as I stood there, the obsidian scales of my arms spreading, slowly consuming my flesh, I understood. I wasn't here to save anyone. I was here to be consumed. I was the Abyss Walker, and my purpose was to extinguish the light, one soul at a time. Abyss Walker, Chapter 2. The Echo of Emptiness. The rain, relentless and cold, was a fitting shroud. It clung to the shattered remains of the gravity night, a grotesque sculpture of twisted metal and shattered bone, and coated the faces of the newly awakened villagers. They were not grateful, not in the way a warrior expects. Their eyes, still glazed with the lingering haze of possession, held a chilling emptiness, a vacant reflection of the green fire that had so recently devoured their hope. They were echoes, ghosts, tethered to a reality now irrevocably marred. Kano remained motionless, a silhouette against the bruised purple of the descending twilight. The obsidian scales had crept further up his arm, a dark bloom against the pale skin, and pulsed with a faint internal violet light. He hadn't moved since the Daimyo's final, pathetic collapse, hadn't even shifted his weight. He was a statue carved from sorrow and void, a monument to destruction. A young woman, no older than 17, approached him, her movements hesitant, almost reverential. Her name was Hana, and she was a healer, a skill rendered utterly useless in this ravaged land. She carried a small ceramic bowl filled with rainwater, meticulously filtered through moss and charcoal. "Ronin-sama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. A small offering, to cleanse the wound, to soothe the lingering darkness. Kano didn't acknowledge her. He simply watched her, his black eyes, now genuinely bottomless, seeming to drink in the light around her. The violet glow intensified within the obsidian scales, a hungry expansion. He didn't offer a nod, a grunt, or any indication of recognition. He was a mirror reflecting only the desolate landscape. Hana, unnerved by his silence, continued to offer the water, her hand trembling. I saw you. When you struck the night. It was beautiful. A terrible beauty. But it saved her." Kano finally spoke, his voice a dry rasp, like the rustle of dead leaves. "Beauty is a lie. Salvation is an illusion." He reached out, not with his katana, but with a single, calloused finger, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from Hana's forehead. The touch was chilling, not with cold, but with an absolute lack of warmth. It was as if he were momentarily displacing the air around her, creating a tiny, localized pocket of emptiness. The village elders speak of a warrior who would sacrifice everything for honor. You offer no honor. You offer only oblivion. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground, subtle at first, then growing into a violent shudder. The rain intensified, becoming a deluge, and the air filled with a high-pitched, keening wail. It wasn't the sound of wind or water. It was something older, something woven into the very fabric of this cursed valley. From the heart of the wrecked fortress, a tendril of the green flame erupted, not with the raging inferno of before, but as a slender, serpentine ribbon of pure, virulent light. It snaked through the ruins, seeking, probing, drawn to the source of the disturbance, Kano. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. He simply tilted his head, as if acknowledging a distant conversation. "The daimyo did not build this fortress," he said, his voice gaining a subtle resonance, as if amplified by the void within him. "He inherited it. The flame is not his. It is an echo of a hunger far older than himself. A hunger that resonates with mine." As he spoke, the obsidian scales on his arm began to pulse violently, a rhythmic, unsettling beat. The violet light exploded outwards, bathing the ruined fortress in an ethereal glow. The green flame, sensing its intrusion, lashed out with renewed ferocity, attempting to engulf him. But Kano met it with a defense he hadn't yet fully mastered: the echo of emptiness. He created a series of miniature void storms, localized pockets of absolute nothingness that shattered the flame's advance, disintegrating it into shimmering particles. Each burst of emptiness left behind a residue of chilling gray, coating the ground and further solidifying the encroaching obsidian. Hana watched in horrified fascination, the rain washing over her, unable to cleanse the sheer scale of the horror unfolding before her. "You're feeding it," she gasped, her voice choked with fear. "You're sustaining the darkness." Kano's eyes narrowed, the black pits deepening. "I am not sustaining it. I am containing it. Like a wound, it must be treated. And sometimes, the only cure is annihilation." He raised his hand, and the elongated dark energy of Kuro-Taiyo began to writhe, reaching towards the green flame. This time, the blade wasn't simply a weapon, it was a conduit, a siphon drawing the essence of the flame, channeling it back into the void within him. The violet light intensified to a blinding white, and the air crackled with unnatural energy. As the last vestiges of the green flame disappeared, Kano collapsed, his body sinking into the rain-soaked earth. The obsidian scales solidified, complete, a seamless extension of his flesh. He was no longer merely a man consumed by the abyss, he was the abyss. He raised his head, his black eyes reflecting not the rain, not the shattered ruins, but the infinite, empty expanse beyond. A single drop of rain, suspended in mid-air, trembled before him, then vanished without a sound. Abyss Walker Chapter 3. The Echo of Silence. The rain continued its relentless assault, a gray shroud clinging to the wreckage of the floating gate. It wasn't cleansing, it was mirroring, reflecting the utter absence of light, the profound stillness that had settled over Gallow's reach. Hana, soaked to the bone and shivering not just from the cold, but from a terror that burrowed deep into her marrow, watched Kano with a mixture of morbid fascination and burgeoning dread. He lay prone amidst the shattered obsidian and the swirling gray residue, a monument to a power she couldn't comprehend, a horror she couldn't escape. He hadn't moved, not visibly, but a subtle shift had occurred, a deepening of the darkness surrounding him. The obsidian scales of his arm pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, like captured stars struggling against an infinite night. The air around him shimmered, not with heat, but with the distortion of space itself, as if he were a tear in the fabric of reality. You destroyed it," Hana stammered, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "The green flame. You consumed it." Kano's voice, when it came, was a dry rustle, like the whisper of wind through ancient, crumbling tombs. "It was a vessel," he said, his black eyes fixed on a point beyond her, beyond the devastation, beyond any recognizable reality. A crude, burning one. Best to simply extinguish the flame, rather than try to sculpt it into something palatable. He shifted slightly, and a hand, already entirely covered in obsidian scales, rose slowly. It wasn't a gesture of movement, but of observation, a precise, unnerving study of the scene. The rain continued to fall, each drop a tiny, glistening testament to the destruction had wrought. "The villagers," Hana said, the raw desperation creeping into her voice. They're whole now. Their souls returned," Kano corrected, the single word laden with a chilling finality. "But the echoes remain." He tilted his head, and Hana saw something flicker within the blackness of his eyes, not recognition, not emotion, but a profound understanding, an awareness of something utterly alien. He raised his hand again, and the elongated Kuro-Taiyo, now fully solidified into a weapon of pure void, began to twitch, vibrating with an almost unbearable energy. The void doesn't simply accept. It remembers, he said, the words laced with a mournful resonance. Every act of destruction leaves a scar, a residue. And this place is drowning in them. He began to move, not with a stride, but with a phasing motion, as if his body were momentarily disentangled from the physical world. The rain seemed to flow around him, not on him. He walked towards the central crater, the epicenter of the devastation, his obsidian hand tracing a path through the gray residue like a serpent exploring a forgotten tomb. Hana instinctively reached for her fan, a simple piece of lacquered wood, a pathetic defense against the overwhelming power he embodied. She had seen the gravity knights crushed, the archers petrified, the daimyo's soul ripped apart, all seemingly inconsequential, yet they held a terrible significance in the context of Kano's actions. He wasn't simply killing, he was unraveling. As Kano neared the crater, the air thinned, growing colder, heavier. The gray residue intensified, coalescing into swirling patterns that resembled fractured constellations. And then he stopped. He stood motionless, facing the crater, and raised his hand. Not to attack, but to listen. The silence was profound, absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Then, Hana heard a whisper, not with her ears, but with something deeper, something primal within her. It was the sound of countless souls, trapped in an eternal loop of anguish, their memories fractured, their identities erased. They weren't screams of pain, but the echoes of forgotten prayers, the sighs of despair, the lamentations of a world devoured. "They are not gone," Kano said, his voice now a chorus of voices, layered and distorted. "They are fragmented, scattered through the currents of the void, like grains of sand in an endless desert." He brought Kuro-Taiyo up, aiming not at the crater, but at the air itself. The blade didn't cut or strike, it absorbed. The violet light intensified, drawing in the echoes, the fragments of souls, pulling them into the black steel. Hana watched in horror as the gray residue visibly receded, the swirling patterns dissolving into nothingness. "The treatment," he intoned, the voices within him growing stronger, "is not erasure, but separation. We sever the connection. We isolate the pain. We deliver them to the silence." As the last echoes vanished, Kano's hand remained raised, the obsidian scales glowing with an unnerving brilliance. He looked at Hana, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw something pass over his face, not sadness, not regret, but an unsettling acceptance. "This is merely a prelude," he said, his voice now purely his own, a low, resonant hum. "The abyss is vast, and it is endlessly hungry." Chapter 4. The Echo of Stone. The rain in Gallow's reach wasn't water. It was the residue of shattered reality, a fine gray dust that clung to skin and choked the lungs with a metallic tang. It smelled of forgotten screams and the ghost of green fire. Hana, numb with a horror she couldn't fully comprehend, followed Kano as he moved with a disconcerting grace through the devastated landscape. The villagers, restored to their fleshy, broken forms, shuffled through the mud, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets with frayed strings. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him, just existed as hollow shells, a testament to the daimyo's consumption. Kano didn't speak either, though the chorus of voices within him was a constant, unsettling presence, sometimes a murmur, sometimes a guttural groan. He moved with a deliberate stillness, as if measuring the space around him with an unseen sensor. Kuro-Taiyo remained sheathed in his arm, the obsidian scales pulsing with a faint violet light, a morbid reflection of the vanished green sun. They reached a ridge overlooking the crater, a jagged maw in the earth where the fortress had plummeted. The air here was thicker, heavier, saturated with a sense of profound absence. Hana instinctively recoiled, a primal urge to flee warring, with a strange, morbid fascination. "Observe," Kano said, his voice a single, resonant note. He raised Kuro-Taiyo. This time, there was no sudden absorption, no violent flash. Instead, the blade pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a living heart. It wasn't directed at the crater, but at a single, elderly woman, sitting slumped against a shattered wall, her face etched with a permanent expression of bewildered sorrow. As the blade neared, the woman didn't flinch. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then, her eyes, already clouded with emptiness, seemed to focus, to remember. A flicker of terror, of recognition, of unbearable pain, crossed her features before it vanished, smoothed away as if a brush had been applied to a canvas. Kuro-Taiyo drew a wisp of violet light, not forceful this time, but delicate, like a spider's silk. It enveloped the woman, not consuming her, but isolating her. The light condensed around her, forming a shimmering, translucent cage, a perfect miniature of the fortress, complete with tiny, impossible spires and a swirling violet vortex at its heart. "The cage," Kano explained, his voice a low rumble, "is a vessel for the fragment. It contains the echo, the memory of the pain, but prevents it from disrupting the equilibrium." He extended a hand, and a small, crystalline shard detached from the cage and floated toward him. He caught it with the tip of Kuro-Taiyo. The moment the blade touched the shard, the violet light flared, and the shard shattered, its essence absorbed entirely into the blade. "We aren't destroying the pain," Kano said, examining the blade. "We are offering it a place to reside, a place of curated solitude." He paused, his black eyes fixated on Hana. "Imagine a single stone, dropped into a still lake. It creates ripples, disturbances. But if you surround it with a barrier, a silence, the ripples diminish, fade. The echo remains, but it is contained, rendered harmless." A shiver ran through Hana. The analogy was chillingly accurate. "But what happens to the person within the cage?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kano didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned his attention to a group of young boys huddled together, their faces stained with ash. He raised Kuro-Taiyo again, targeting the air between them. The violet light spread, and soon, identical cages, mirroring the fortress, were suspended around each boy. "They are no longer slaves to the daimyo's hunger," he said, his voice laced with a disturbing calmness. "They are curators of silence. Their pain is their burden, their solace, a perpetual stillness, chosen by them, granted by us." As he spoke, Hana noticed something unsettling. The boys within the cages weren't merely observing their surroundings. They were reacting. A faint smile touched one boy's lips, a glimmer of something, perhaps joy, perhaps madness in his eyes. Another began to hum a tuneless melody, a desperate, repetitive refrain that resonated with the fractured echoes in the air. "You are seeing the consequence of separation," Kano said, his voice hardening. "The void does not simply erase. It redirects. It offers a choice, a carefully crafted prison of pain. A beautiful, terrible prison." He looked at Hana again. And this time, the fleeting flicker of something not acceptance, but something darker passed over his face. It was the gaze of a collector, of a man who had discovered an endless supply of exquisite, agonizing treasures. "The abyss," he said, a cold, final note in his voice, "is not a hunger. It is a taxonomy." He raised Kuro-Taiyo one last time, and for a heartbeat, Hana felt a profound, suffocating dread. It wasn't the fear of death, but the terror of being classified, of being catalogued, of being permanently trapped within a cage of his own making. "And you, Hana," he continued, his voice layered with the voices of 1,000 lost souls, "are a specimen worthy of study." Chapter 5. Taxonomy. The rain in Gallow's reach wasn't rain. It was a weeping, viscous silver, drawn from the ravaged earth and stained with the residue of devoured souls. It slicked the obsidian scales creeping across Kano's right arm, reflecting the bruised violet sky like 1,000 broken mirrors. He moved with a dreadful grace, a predator unburdened by the constraints of humanity, further into the ruined heart of the fortress. The air thrummed with a low, dissonant hum, a chorus of displaced memories and shattered emotions. Hana followed, a pale ghost in the swirling silver, her hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of her own mundane katana. It felt paltry, a child's toy against the monstrous reality she had witnessed. The fortress, stripped of its demonic energy, was a husk, a testament to the daimyo's grotesque ambition. Its stone walls were slick with a viscous fluid that smelled of ozone and regret. "You understand," Kano said, his voice a dry rasp, "that this is not merely destruction. It is an orchestration." He gestured with Kuro-Taiyo, the blade shimmering with contained darkness. The daimyo didn't simply eat souls. He curated them. He refined them. Each suffering, each moment of despair, was a note in a symphony of pain, orchestrated to produce a resonance, a power. They entered a vast chamber, the throne room now a fractured mosaic of collapsed masonry. At its center, etched into the bedrock, was a complex network of interlocking circles and spirals, a geomantic diagram pulsing with a faint, sickly green light. This was the heart of the resonance, the focal point of the daimyo's twisted art. "The children," Kano continued, his eyes fixed on the diagram, "were not victims. They were instruments. Each cage, each enforced silence, each carefully manufactured sorrow amplified the resonance. Their pain became the fuel, and the resonance amplified the power of the green fire." He paused, tilting his head, a gesture that seemed unnervingly inquisitive. "A particularly potent strain of sorrow, you see, possesses an extraordinary energetic signature." He approached the largest cage, a towering iron structure that had once contained the largest of the soul fuel. Inside, a boy, no older than 12, lay motionless, his eyes glazed over. He was no longer simply a vessel of pain. A single perfect tear traced a path down his cheek, reflecting the green luminescence. "Observe," Kano instructed, holding Kuro-Taiyo aloft. The black steel pulsed, drawing the green light into its depths. The boy's eyes flickered open, not with fear, but with a chilling recognition. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "He understands," Kano said, his voice devoid of inflection. "He recognizes the exquisite beauty of his suffering. The void grants no escape, but it offers perspective. It shows you the inherent logic of pain." He moved to touch the cage, but hesitated. "It's fascinating, isn't it? The capacity for a mind to construct its own prison, to actively embrace the torment. We don't force the silence. We simply encourage it. We allow it to blossom, like a rare orchid, nurtured in the darkest soil." A guttural sound escaped the boy's lips, a moan of profound sadness, perfectly controlled, utterly devoid of desperate plea. Kano's hand moved, not with violence, but with a deliberate, almost reverential touch. As his fingers brushed against the cage's bars, a ripple spread across the geomantic diagram, intensifying the green light. "The taxonomy," he muttered, his voice shifting, becoming layered with the echoes of countless tormented voices. "It's not about destruction. It's about categorization. We collect these anomalies, these individuals who have achieved the ultimate state of quietude, and add them to the collection. Each specimen provides a new data point, a new understanding." He turned to Hana, his obsidian arm a terrifying sculpture of shadow and steel. You, Hana, are particularly interesting. Your resistance, your inherent drive for a solution. It's a remarkable counterpoint, a valuable addition to the collection. He studied her with unsettling intensity, as if cataloging her very essence. Your fear is a crucial element, of course. It fuels the resonance. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over Hana. The room seemed to shift, the geometry distorting around her. She felt a pressure on her mind, a cold, probing sensation, as if an immense intelligence was dissecting her thoughts, categorizing her emotions. The void isn't hungry, she realized, a chilling understanding dawning. It doesn't consume. It compiles. Kano raised Kuro-Taiyo, the blade now elongated into a shimmering whip of darkness. And you, Hana, are a specimen worthy of study. You will become another note in the symphony. He lunged, not with an attack, but with a gesture, a deliberate extension of the blade towards her. It wasn't an attempt to harm her, but to classify her, to add her to the grand taxonomy of the abyss. The silver rain intensified, washing over them both, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. Hana braced herself, not with a prayer, but with a grim acceptance. She was not fighting for her survival. She was fighting for her categorization. Chapter 6. The Cartographer of Souls, the silver rain, thick as mercury, clung to Hana's skin, a viscous shroud mirroring the growing unease in her soul. It wasn't merely the cold, the damp, or the suffocating silence of Kano's presence that pressed upon her, but a deeper, more fundamental violation. It was the feeling of being observed, dissected, reduced to a data point in a terrifying equation. Kano moved with a horrifying grace. Kuro-Taiyo, a living extension of his will. The blade wasn't driven towards her in a desperate assault, but in a slow, deliberate spiral, tracing an invisible circle around her head. Each revolution of the darkness seemed to amplify the pressure in her mind, a subtle insistence that she was something to be categorized, to be understood. You're mistaken, Hana. Kano's voice was a low rumble, resonating not just in her ears, but in the very marrow of her bones. The void isn't a monster. It's a mirror. And every reflection, however horrifying, holds a truth. He stopped the blade inches from her face, the black steel catching the faint, sickly glow emanating from the shattered remnants of the green flame. His eyes, still pools of impenetrable darkness, seemed to penetrate her very being, sifting through her memories, her hopes, her fears, reducing them to a series of algorithms. The villagers, he continued, his voice gaining a measured cadence. They weren't drained. They were assembled. Their souls, raw and fractured, were harnessed, refined, made compatible. He raised Kuro-Taiyo again, this time not with a gesture of classification, but with a subtle adjustment, as if recalibrating a delicate instrument. The daimyo didn't simply feed on them. He orchestrated their transformation. The dizziness intensified, a sickening swirl of fractured images, glimpses of the villagers before the corruption, moments of unbearable suffering, and then the horrifying realization that their torment was not an end, but a beginning. They were being molded, shaped, not into fuel, but into components of something else. Hana recognized then the horrifying truth underpinning Kano's obsession. He wasn't hunting monsters, he was collecting the blueprints of consciousness. The void wasn't a hunger, but an insatiable desire to understand the fundamental architecture of existence, to map the pathways of the soul itself. You're resisting, Kano stated, his voice devoid of judgment, simply an observation, a predictable response. But resistance, like fear, is merely another variable in the equation. Your emotional state, your memories, your very essence, they offer a unique insight into the structure of the void's influence. He stepped closer, Kuro-Taiyo hovering before her, the shadows it cast dancing with an unnerving sentience. The pressure in her mind reached a fever pitch. She felt herself unraveling, her thoughts dissolving into a chaotic stream of sensation. Images of her past, of her family, of her training with the ronin, all distorted, fragmented, viewed through the cold analytical lens of the void. Suddenly, she understood. Kano wasn't trying to consume her. He was attempting to rewrite her. He wasn't interested in her soul as a thing to be destroyed, but as a template, a model to be replicated. With a surge of adrenaline, Hana acted, not with a desperate attack, but with a calculated disruption. Focusing all her will, she reached for the core of her own being, the remnants of her identity, and willed it to resist. It was a struggle against an overwhelming tide, a desperate attempt to hold on to the fragile shape of herself. As she did, a single clear thought pierced through the confusion, a memory of her mentor, the old swordsmith, teaching her to forge her spirit as surely as she forged steel. The greatest strength, he had said, lies not in resisting the heat, but in shaping it. The obsidian scales on Kano's arm pulsed with a brief, blinding light. He recoiled slightly, as if struck by an unseen force. Kuro-Taiyo wavered, the darkness within the blade momentarily destabilized. "Interesting," he murmured, studying her with a flicker of something akin to surprise. A rudimentary understanding. Primitive, but persistent. He lowered the blade, a subtle shift in his demeanor. For the first time, Hana sensed not just an analytical gaze, but a hint of curiosity. "You possess a remarkable capacity for adaptation," he said, his voice softening slightly. "A quality not often found in specimens of your composition. You are disrupting the pattern. You are creating an anomaly." He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the scar on his arm. Perhaps, he mused, a strange, almost wistful expression crossing his features. Perhaps the void isn't always seeking to compile. Perhaps it's sometimes seeking to learn. He paused, his gaze fixed on her, a disturbing blend of cold calculation and nascent fascination. "And you, Hana, are proving to be an unexpectedly valuable teacher." Chapter 7. Echoes in the Obsidian. The rain in Gallow's reach had ceased, leaving the iron-rimmed valley slick and reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the lingering scent of burnt soul, a smell Kano had grown accustomed to, a morbid perfume of his victories. He stood before Hana, not in the throne room's shattered remains, but in a crumbling observation post overlooking the ravaged village square. The skeletal remains of gravity knights lay scattered amidst the mud, their armor twisted like grotesque flowers. The villagers, slowly regaining their humanity, moved with a haunted grace, their eyes reflecting the dull glow of the remaining embers. Hana was meticulously cleaning Kuro-Taiyo, her movements precise, almost reverential. She'd salvaged the obsidian scales that had fallen during the daimyo's final moments, arranging them on a makeshift altar fashioned from a broken pillar. It was a strange ritual, born of a desperate need to understand the shifting nature of Kano's weapon, a desire that felt increasingly unsettling to him. "You are still focused on the mechanics," Kano observed, his voice a low rasp. He hadn't moved from his position. A silhouette against the fading light, Kuro-Taiyo's black steel, perpetually shimmering. "The void isn't simply a force to be dissected. It's a river. And you, Hana, are attempting to chart its course with a child's stick." Hana paused, her hand still holding the blade. "I am attempting to understand the source of its power," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The entropy shielded doesn't just negate the flame, it erases it. That requires a level of control, a fundamental understanding of the fabric of existence that I haven't encountered in any existing texts. Your approach, it's brute force, a desperate clawing at a fundamental truth." Kano shifted slightly, the obsidian scales on his arm pulsating with a rhythm that was subtly unsettling. "Brute force has served me well," he admitted, the black pits of his eyes reflecting the dull light. "But you are right, perhaps. The void doesn't simply do. It observes. It questions. He tilted his head, studying the arrangement of the obsidian scales. You're attempting to replicate the conditions of its creation. The severance. But the void isn't built. It is. He ran a calloused finger across the scar on his arm, a gesture that seemed to draw the darkness in closer. There's a resonance here, Hana. A trace of the god who granted me this burden. It's faint, fractured, but it's present. Not a conscious entity. Not in the way you understand. More like an echo, a solidified fragment of oblivion. Suddenly, Kuro-Taiyo flared with an intense, blinding light. Hana instinctively shielded her eyes, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. The air shimmered around Kano, the obsidian scales on his arm expanding, crawling upwards with terrifying speed. He grunted, a sound of pure, primal agony, as the transformation accelerated. The dark steel pulsed with an internal storm, feeding on the ambient darkness, growing larger, more defined. The pattern it's strengthening, Kano gasped, his voice strained. The void is responding to your attempts to shape it. It's learning. The scar on his arm now resembled a blossoming vortex of absolute darkness, the obsidian scales coalescing into a grotesque stylized representation of a coiled serpent. Hana watched in horrified fascination as Kuro-Taiyo lengthened, the blade becoming a shimmering whip of pure negative energy. "You're amplifying it," she shouted, struggling to maintain her composure. "You're feeding it with your curiosity, with your understanding." Kano didn't respond, lost in a silent, internal battle. The serpent-shaped scales writhed, emitting a low, guttural hum. He lowered the weapon slowly, the whip of darkness receding slightly, returning to its familiar, contained form. He regarded Hana with an expression that was no longer simply analytical, but something akin to regret. "I underestimated you, Hana," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I believed the void offered only destruction, only oblivion. But you are showing me that it holds a potential for something more. Something beyond comprehension." He paused, his black eyes fixated on the altar where Hana had arranged the obsidian scales. "This isn't merely about stopping a daimyo," he murmured, his voice laced with a chilling certainty. "It's about understanding the nature of this connection. About learning to control not just the blade, but the void itself." He took a step closer to her, the scent of ozone growing stronger. "The line between us is blurring, Hana. Your understanding is a key, a flawed one perhaps, but a key nonetheless. And I'm beginning to believe that the abyss isn't just seeking to consume. It's seeking a reflection." Chapter 8. The Echo, in the Black. The rain in Gallow's reach had shifted. No longer a brutal, acidic downpour, but a weeping gray mist that clung to the shattered remnants of the fortress and the newly risen, shivering villagers. Hana watched Kano, from the relative safety of the ruined temple, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood, and the lingering scent of ozone. The obsidian scales crawling across his arm pulsed with a faint internal light, a morbid heartbeat reflecting the devastation had wrought. Kano was motionless, leaning against a moss-covered column. Kuro-Taiyo retracted, the scar on his arm a dark, unsettling bloom. It wasn't a posture of triumph, but of profound, unsettling contemplation. He looked less like a warrior and more like a living monument to a forgotten horror. "Yuve altered the blade," Hana stated, her voice tight, the words tasting like ash. "Yuve pushed it further. The control it's fragmented, scattered like shattered glass." Kano turned his head, his eyes, still pools of impossible black, fixed on her with unnerving intensity. "Fragmentation is not a failure, Hana. It is an acknowledgement of reality. The void isn't a singular entity, a monolithic force. It is a tapestry woven from countless echoes, each one a potential pathway. I was attempting to grasp at a thread, to understand its resonance. And you demonstrated the inherent instability of that endeavor." He reached out, his hand a disconcerting blend of flesh and shimmering obsidian hovering inches from her face. The air around him shimmered, distorting her vision momentarily. You perceive the void as a source of destruction, a bottomless maw. But it is also a mirror. It reflects our own desires, our own fears. When I tapped into its potential, I wasn't just channeling power, I was inviting a reflection of myself, a reflection of my own hunger. Hana took a step back, clutching at a crumbling stone wall for support. The realization of what he was saying, the terrifying implications, clawed at her. You're saying the abyss, it wants to be seen? More than seen, Kano corrected, his voice a low rumble. It craves confirmation. The more we attempt to comprehend it, the more we actively shape its form. It is a conversation, Hana, a terrifying, potentially infinite one. He paused, a strange, almost mournful expression crossing his face. And I, in my arrogance, believed I could dictate the terms. He raised his hand again, and Kuro-Taiyo, with a groan of tortured metal, began to lengthen, not into the whip of pure darkness, but into a more delicate, serpentine form. The scales writhed faster, the guttural hum intensifying. No longer a warning, but a resonant song, a hymn to something alien and vast. This wasn't a weapon being summoned. It was a nascent entity struggling to coalesce. I've been observing, Kano continued, his voice almost lost in the growing hum. The villagers, their desperation, their fear, their utter reliance on the daimyo's gift. It wasn't simply a drain of their souls. It was a reflection of a deeper, more insidious hunger, a hunger for meaning, for purpose. The daimyo provided that, albeit through a grotesque parody of faith. The void. It feeds on that hunger as well. He brought the blade to his face, tracing its length with a finger. I came here seeking a single solution, a decisive strike. But the solution is not annihilation, not even of the daimyo. The solution lies in understanding why he was able to summon such power in the first place. Suddenly, the hum ceased. Kuro-Taiyo retracted entirely, the obsidian scales receding, the scar on Kano's arm smoothing out slightly. He straightened, his posture regaining a semblance of the warrior he had been, though the darkness in his eyes remained, deeper, more profound. The serpent was a mistake, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. A momentary lapse, a glimpse into a truth I was not yet prepared to face. He turned to Hana, his gaze searching. You asked me why I'm doing this. I will answer you now. I am not simply hunting monsters. I am collecting echoes, fragments of a forgotten history. The daimyo wasn't a demon. He was a conduit, a vessel. He took a step forward, extending his hand again. This time, he didn't offer it to her. Instead, he touched his temple, a gesture of profound discomfort. I felt it, Hana. A resonance, a faint whisper within the void, the name of a god, long since forgotten. A god that demanded sacrifices not of souls, but of memories. The rain intensified, blurring the edges of the ruined temple. The green mist clung to Kano's skin, transforming him into something truly alien, a warrior forged in the heart of oblivion. And I, he whispered, his voice laced with a chilling, almost unbearable sorrow. I am beginning to suspect that I am not just fighting the abyss. I am becoming it. Chapter 9. The cartographer of lost things, the rain hammered against the shattered remnants of the temple, a relentless mournful drumming that mirrored the ache in Kano's bones. Hana, a fragile silhouette against the pulsating green mist, watched him with a quiet, desperate apprehension. He stood motionless, the obsidian scales of his arms still subtly shifting, like restless, frozen magma. The silence, broken only by the deluge, pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. The serpent, Kano repeated. His voice, a low rasp, was a key, not to summoning power, but to unlocking a prison. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the ravaged landscape, a tapestry of twisted stone, blackened earth, and the lingering, sickly green glow. The daimyo wasn't a vessel for demonic energy, he was a ward. A cage built to contain something far older, far more terrible than any demon. He gestured towards a particularly large section of the collapsed wall, where a smear of phosphorescent green clung to the rubble. Observe. This isn't the residue of a battle. This is distortion. A thinning of reality, like a hole punched through the fabric of existence. Hana cautiously approached, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather pouch at her hip. The air around the ruined wall throbbed with a faint, unsettling vibration. As she drew closer, she noticed something faint, swirling patterns etched into the disturbed stone, like the ghostly outlines of letters or symbols. "What is it?" Kano asked, his voice laced with a disconcerting eagerness. I don't know," Hana stammered, kneeling to examine the markings. "It looks like a map. A very old, very fractured map. She carefully brushed away the clinging mist, revealing more of the intricate patterns. They weren't merely symbols, they seemed to shift and rearrange themselves subtly as she looked at them, defying any attempt at comprehension. Kano moved beside her, his face a mask of grim fascination. "It's a cartography of forgotten things. Memories stolen, histories erased, realities warped." The daimyo was deliberately constructing this labyrinth, layer upon layer, to contain a being of pure conceptual negation. Suddenly, Kuro-Taiyo pulsed with a deeper, darker light. The obsidian scales on Kano's arm flared, casting jagged shadows that danced across the rain-soaked stone. He raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of intense concentration. "It's responding," he murmured, "to the activation of the map." A wave of violet energy, far more controlled and precise than the chaotic blasts had used before, emanated from him, washing over the wall. The swirling patterns intensified, coalescing into a single stark image, a colossal, abstract form, resembling a shattered mirror reflecting an infinite void. "This," Kano said, his voice strained, "is what the god demanded. Not a soul, but the essence of understanding. A perfect, complete knowledge of oblivion." The daimyo, driven mad by this thirst for annihilation, sought to achieve it. And in doing so, he inadvertently opened a gateway. He clutched his head, a guttural sound escaping his lips. The resonance, it's growing stronger. The whispers are louder. He swayed, momentarily losing his footing. Hana rushed to steady him. "You're hurting yourself," she cried, her voice laced with panic. "It's a necessary pain," Kano replied, his eyes no longer black pits, but shimmering with a cold internal light. "I'm attempting to decipher the map's purpose, to understand the mechanism by which this god exerts its influence." He began to move, not with the fluid grace of a warrior, but with a jerky, almost mechanical precision, tracing the contours of the solidified image with his finger. As he moved, the green mist around him thickened, solidifying into shimmering, spectral figures, fragments of the shattered mirror, reflecting distorted versions of the temple, of Hana, of Kano himself. Each reflection seemed to emanate a chilling sense of emptiness, a profound lack of meaning. "The god feeds on doubt, on apathy, on the cessation of all desire," he said, his voice layered with a horrifying realization. "It doesn't need to destroy it, simply uncreates." He stopped abruptly, his hand frozen mid-trace. He stared at Hana, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. "Do you understand, Hana? The destruction we've wrought, the lives lost, it's not an act of malice. It's a palliative care. We are simply accelerating the inevitable." The rain intensified, blurring everything into a swirling, monochromatic nightmare. Kuro-Taiyo pulsed again, violently this time, and the obsidian scales on Kano's arm erupted in a blinding flash of black light. He staggered backward, clutching his arm as if in agonizing pain. "I'm losing control," he gasped, his voice choked with a horrifying mixture of triumph and despair. The abyss, it's not just listening. It's learning. He looked at Hannah, a single word escaping his lips, a chilling testament to the transformation consuming him lost. Chapter 10. The Echo of Absence. The rain hammered down on Gallow's reach with a renewed fury, each drop a tiny, icy hammer against the shattered remains of the floating fortress. The air tasted of ozone and something older, something like the absence of memory. Kano stood amidst the swirling mist, a silhouette carved from shadow and burgeoning obsidian, his movements now unsettlingly precise, like a clockwork mechanism wound too tight. The right arm, entirely consumed by the scales, pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic throb, a dark heartbeat within a corpse. Hannah knelt beside him, her face pale beneath the bruised gray sky, her movements slow, almost reverential. She offered him a small, intricately carved wooden prayer tablet, a depiction of a crane taking flight, a symbol of longevity and hope. He didn't take it. He merely watched her, his eyes, now pools of absolute black, reflecting nothing but the storm's bleakness. "The god it whispers now," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp, less a spoken sentence and more a fragment of an echo. Not promises of power, but suggestions. "It tells me how to perfect the process." He raised a hand, the obsidian scales shifting, forming intricate patterns that resembled grasping claws. The air around him rippled, not with the violent distortions of the shadow blight, but with a subtle, unsettling stillness. The spectral figures, fragments of shattered reflections, grew stronger, more numerous, swirling around him in a vortex of emptiness. They weren't merely mimicking him, they anticipated him. "It showed me," Kano continued, a disturbing calm settling over him, the reason for the daimyo's obsession with the green flame. It wasn't a hunger for souls, it was a desperate attempt to preserve them, a futile effort to combat the inevitable decay, the inherent nothingness at the core of all things. He took a step forward, the sound of his boots-worn leather and corroded steel somehow muted, swallowed by the storm. The flame wasn't a weapon, it was an embalming fluid. It was prolonging a dying existence, trapped in a cycle of consumption and denial. "Hana," her voice a fragile thread in the maelstrom, asked, "But why us, Kano-sama? Why did it choose us to be the instruments of this palliative care?" Kano didn't answer directly. Instead, he focused his gaze on a young boy, no older than 8, huddled beneath a shattered archway, his face stained with dirt and grief. The boy's eyes, wide with terror and loss, seemed to drain of all color, fading to a dull gray. As the boy's light extinguished, a new spectral figure coalesced around Kano, mirroring the boy's form perfectly, but twisted, corrupted. It wasn't a simple copy, it was an echo of his sorrow, a solidified manifestation of his despair. "It doesn't choose us," Kano finally said, his voice laced with a chilling revelation. "It chooses the weakest link, the vessels most susceptible to the void. We are not warriors, Hana. We are conduits." The obsidian scales on his arm flared violently, bathing the scene in an unbearable black light. He clutched his forearm, a silent scream trapped within his throat. The pain wasn't physical. It was the tearing of his soul, the fracturing of his identity as the abyss seeped deeper into him. "It wants to understand," he gasped, "to experience, to feel the cessation of all things. The irony is exquisite." He looked at Hannah, his expression shifting, momentarily hardening with a flicker of his former self. "I was fighting for honor, for justice. But all I've done is become a flawed reflection of the very evil I sought to destroy." Suddenly, he moved with a terrifying speed, blurring into a black streak. He raised Kuro-Taiyo, the blade now elongated into a whip of pure darkness, and lashed out, not at the remnants of the fortress, but at the spectral figures swirling around him. Each blow didn't merely shatter the reflections, it consumed them, obliterating them entirely, leaving behind nothing but swirling mist and a chilling silence. As he finished, he collapsed, the obsidian scales receding slightly, revealing glimpses of flesh beneath. His breath came in ragged gasps. It is feeding?" he whispered, his voice strained. "Not on souls, but on memories, on the echoes of what once was. It's not about destruction, Hannah. It's about the erasure of existence itself." He raised a hand, and a single perfect tear traced a path down his cheek, freezing instantly upon contact with the rain. He stared at the tear, a profound, desolate understanding dawning in his black eyes. "I am not a warrior," he murmured, his voice a ghostly whisper carried on the wind. "I am a mirror, and I am reflecting the abyss." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Hannah thought she saw a flicker of something, a ghost of a smile. A trace of the man she had once known before the darkness consumed him entirely. When he opened his eyes again, they were perfectly empty, reflecting only the swirling gray of the storm and the infinite terrifying void within. "Lost," he repeated, the single word echoing across the desolate valley, a chilling testament to the fate of the Abyss Walker. Chapter 11. Echoes in ash, the rain continued, a cold, relentless shroud. The valley of Gallow's Reach was a canvas of bruised gray and charcoal, the stench of burnt bone and fading memory clinging to the air like a poisonous fog. Hannah, drenched and shivering, moved with a grim reverence, her footsteps careful on the slick, ash-covered ground. She followed Kano's trail, a barely perceptible shift in the swirling mist, a subtle discoloration in the stone where Head knelt. He hadn't moved, not in the way a living man would. He was an imprint, a ghost, solidified by the very thing he was combating. Kano lay sprawled at the base of a shattered obsidian pillar, a fragment of the daimyo's fortress, now a jagged tooth in the landscape. His right arm, completely encased in obsidian scales, rested unnaturally still. The Kuro-Taiyo vanished, yet its presence radiated a profound, suffocating cold. He hadn't been dead. Not exactly. He was fragmented. His body was a vessel, a crumbling husk resonating with the echoes of a consumed existence. Hannah approached cautiously, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn, bone-handled katana strapped to her back. She wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. She was a scholar, a historian obsessed with the legends surrounding the void-blooded, those rare individuals capable of wielding weapons born from oblivion. Kano was the last. And now, he was dissolving. She knelt beside him, a futile gesture of respect. "Kano-sama," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the storm. No response, just the unsettling stillness, the palpable sense of something utterly wrong. As she examined him, she noticed something new. Around his torso, almost like frost, were delicate patterns etched into the flesh beneath the obsidian. They weren't wounds, they were configurations of miniature. Swirling voids, miniature reflections of the abyss itself. Each one pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, a sickly, ethereal green. "It's accelerating," she breathed, her voice laced with a horrified realization. The consumption. She had spent weeks studying the ancient texts, poring over fragmented scrolls detailing the entropy inherent within the Kuro-Taiyo, the nature of the void blood's power. She understood, with a chilling clarity, that Kano wasn't just destroying evil, he was becoming it. The blade didn't merely sever connections, it unraveled the threads of reality itself. He wasn't fighting the daimyo, he was feeding him. Suddenly, a voice, not spoken aloud, but directly into her mind, a whisper carried on the chilling wind. "The hunger is not for power, Hannah. It is for knowing." Hannah recoiled, clutching her head. The voice was a resonance, a fractured fragment of Kano's consciousness, layered over her own. It wasn't a plea, not a warning. It was an observation. "You see," the voice continued, "the daimyo wasn't born evil. He was shaped by evil, by grief, by loss, by the accumulation of unbearable memories. The green flame wasn't a weapon. It was a desperate, futile attempt to exorcise the shadows within him. And I'm the ultimate exorcism. She noticed a single, perfectly formed tear clinging to the obsidian scales of his arm, frozen mid-fall. It shimmered, not with water, but with captured light, a miniature aurora of trapped color. As she reached out to touch it, the voice intensified. Every touch, every memory feeds the void. It doesn't erase. It rewrites. The past isn't a fixed point, Hannah. It's a pliable clay, molded by sorrow and regret. She understood then. Kano wasn't simply a warrior, he was a collector of oblivion. He wasn't destroying the daimyo, he was absorbing his memories, his emotions, his soul, feeding them to the abyss, adding another layer of nothingness to the endless, consuming darkness. A movement caught her eye. A faint, shimmering distortion in the air near the obsidian pillar. A spectral echo of the daimyo, not a solid form, but a swirling vortex of regret and anguish. It reached out a translucent hand, attempting to grasp at Kano, attempting to reclaim the stolen fragments. Kano didn't resist. He simply tilted his head, his empty black eyes fixated on the spectral image. "You mistake the reflection for the substance," he murmured, the voice now layered with an almost unbearable sadness. "I am not fighting your past. I am becoming it. You sought to control the shadows, Hana. I am embracing the darkness." With a gesture, he raised his obsidian hand. A shower of miniature voids erupted from the scales, each one striking the spectral image. Not with force, but with comprehension. The figure dissolved, not with a violent shattering, but with a serene acceptance, like a snowflake melting in warm water. As the last echo vanished, Kano's body began to shift. The obsidian scales spread, creeping upwards, consuming his flesh with an insidious, silent efficiency. He wasn't dying, he was becoming one with the void. Hana watched, paralyzed, as the last vestiges of Kano disappeared, leaving behind only a smooth, black surface, a perfect reflection of the storm, a terrifying monument to the ultimate erasure. "Lost," he repeated, the single word echoing across the desolate valley, no longer a testament to fate, but a self-fulfilling prophecy. The abyss had won. Chapter 12. The Obsidian Bloom. The rain in Gallow's reach had ceased, leaving behind a slick, iridescent sheen on the shattered remains of the floating fortress. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of dissolved metal, and something colder, something ancient, and infinitely sad, the residue of a soul unmade. Hana, a survivor among the newly reclaimed, remained rooted to the spot where Kano had fallen, a silent sentinel of a horror she couldn't quite process. Her hand instinctively reached for the chipped jade amulet she wore, a paltry talisman against the vast, uncaring emptiness. The obsidian pillar, the source of the disturbance, still stood, a grotesque monument against the bruised lavender sky. It wasn't pulsing anymore, the green fire extinguished, but it radiated a chilling stillness, a captured echo of the daimyo's tormented existence. Around it, the villagers, their faces still bearing the faintest tracings of the drained anguish, began the arduous task of rebuilding, their movements mechanical, devoid of the frantic terror that had gripped them for so long. Kano was gone. Not in the traditional sense of death. He hadn't bled out, hadn't crumbled into dust. He had unfolded. The obsidian scales that had begun to bloom from his forearm had completed their gruesome ascension, consuming him entirely, leaving behind a flawless, polished monolith, a mirror to the storm, a testament to a sacrifice made not to life, but to oblivion. A young boy, no older than 8, approached Hana cautiously. He carried a small salvaged shard of ceramic, meticulously smoothing it with his fingers. "They say," he whispered, his voice thin and reedy, that the Abyss Walker he offered himself to the darkness. Hana didn't reply. She couldn't. The boy's words were a brutal, undeniable truth. Kano hadn't been a hero. He had been a predator, a devourer of shadows. But he had chosen this fate, embracing the void with a terrifying, almost religious fervor. Suddenly, a low hum resonated from the pillar, a vibration that settled not in the ears, but in the bones. The obsidian surface began to shift subtly, like water disturbed by a gentle current. A single, perfect, black flower, a bloom of impossible geometry, erupted from the center of the pillar's surface. It didn't reflect the sky, didn't reflect anything. It simply was. A pocket of absolute absence, radiating a faint, frigid light. From within this bloom, a voice emerged, not spoken, but felt. It resonated directly within Hana's mind, a torrent of fragmented memories, regrets, and a profound, overwhelming loneliness. It wasn't Kano's voice, not precisely. It was the fractured echo of his soul, amplified by the void he had become. "You study me, Hana," the voice murmured, "but you understand nothing. You seek to comprehend the mechanism of destruction, but you fail to grasp its purpose." The bloom pulsed again, and a single shimmering tendril extended from it, snaking towards Hana. It didn't touch her, it brushed against her mind, probing, dissecting, not with malice, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. She experienced, in a dizzying rush, the agonizing moments of the Daimyo's final battle, the searing agony of the green flame, the desperate struggle against the entropy shield, the sickening realization of his own impending demise. She saw Kano, not as a warrior, but as a broken instrument, a tool of oblivion. "I did not seek to destroy," the voice continued, now laced with a sorrow so profound it threatened to shatter Hana's sanity. "I sought to release." The daimyo clung to existence, to the illusion of control, trapped in a cycle of suffering fueled by his own ambition. The green flame was a reflection of that clinging, a desperate, burning attempt to hold on to something that was inherently transient. The tendril retreated, retracting back into the obsidian bloom. The flower continued to radiate its unsettling silence, a silent indictment of humanity's futile desires. As the echoes of the daimyo's fragmented consciousness faded, the obsidian pillar began to weep. Not with water, but with a viscous black fluid that slowly seeped across the ravaged earth, forming a small, glistening pool at Kano's feet. As the fluid spread, it began to coalesce, to take shape, forming miniature versions of the black bloom, each one pulsating with the same chilling stillness. Hana realized then that Kano hadn't simply absorbed the void. He had become the void. And now, his essence was propagating, transforming the very landscape into a tapestry of oblivion. She looked at her hand, instinctively reaching for the jade amulet. It felt warm, fragile, a desperate plea for connection in a world dissolving into nothingness. The amulet, she realized, was useless. "Lost," she whispered, the word echoing across the desolate valley, not a prophecy, but an observation. "Lost is the only truth left." The obsidian blooms pulsed, a silent, terrifying chorus of acceptance, reflecting the desolate sky, mirroring the abyss within. The weight of the void, it seemed, wasn't just Kano's. It was becoming hers. Chapter 13. The echo of ash. The rain began as a gray smudge on the horizon, a weeping stain against the bruised purple of the sky. It wasn't water, not truly. It was the same viscous, obsidian fluid that had formed around Kano's feet, now cascading down the fractured remains of the fortress, a morbid baptism in the heart of oblivion. The air hung thick, with the scent of burnt bone and something older, something fundamentally wrong, like the silence before a universe collapses. Hana knelt beside Kano, a small, fragile figure amidst the devastation. The ronin was immobile, a statue carved from night, his right arm a grotesque blossom of obsidian scales. The flower hadn't shrunk, it had doubled in size, its petals unfurling slightly, revealing a core of absolute black. A faint, rhythmic pulse throbbed within it, a heartbeat of nothingness. He didn't react to her presence. Kano rarely did. His eyes, pools of unending darkness, held no discernible emotion, no flicker of regret, no hint of the agonizing price had paid. He was a vessel, emptied and filled with the echoing despair of 1,000 devoured souls. The bloomets spreading, Hana stated, her voice barely a murmur against the relentless drumming of the obsidian rain. She gestured to a cluster of the miniature blooms forming around a shattered section of the fortress wall. Slick, dark replicas of the central flower, each radiating a chilling stillness. Kano shifted slightly, a minuscule movement that sent a ripple through the shifting scales of his arm. "It feeds," he rasped, his voice a low, guttural vibration. On the absence, he raised his hand, and a single bloom detached itself from the main flower, drifting through the air like a fallen star. It landed on a pile of ash, the remains of a gravity knight, reduced to a collection of pulverized stone and fractured metal. The bloom absorbed the ash, the stillness intensifying, the darkness deepening. Within moments, the ash vanished, leaving behind a perfectly formed miniature of the obsidian flower, pulsing with the same unsettling rhythm. The soul wasn't consumed, Hana realized, a shudder running through her. It was unmade. Kano didn't respond. He was lost in the process, a solitary practitioner of a horrifying art. Hana understood, with a sickening clarity, that he hadn't just broken the daimyo head, fractured the very fabric of reality. The void blade hadn't merely delivered a fatal blow, it had sown a seed. "Why?" she asked, the question a desperate plea for some explanation, some justification in this landscape of impossible horror. He finally turned his head, the dark eyes locking onto hers. "The world," he said, his voice gaining a chilling resonance, "is built on illusion. Faith, loyalty, even death, they are all fleeting shadows. The only true constant is the absence of something." He extended his hand again, and another bloom detached, this one hovering over her. Hana instinctively raised her arm, clutching the jade amulet tighter, a frantic gesture of futile resistance. The bloom pulsed closer, and she felt a strange, cold pressure against her mind, a sensation of being drawn towards a void, a place devoid of memory, of hope, of self. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting against the encroaching darkness. The amulet, warm against her skin, offered a fleeting comfort, a reminder of the world she had lost. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was a fragile defense. "You are becoming it," she whispered, the observation a chilling acceptance. Kano's eyes narrowed. "I am a conduit," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "The void is a force, not a singular entity. It whispers in the cracks of existence, in the forgotten corners of the heart. I merely listen." Suddenly, the obsidian rain intensified, converging around them in a swirling vortex. From the heart of the vortex, a single immense bloom, erupted a towering obsidian flower, its petals wider than a man, its core radiating an overwhelming darkness. It dwarfed Kano, threatening to consume him entirely. He didn't flinch. He stood his ground, Kuro-Taiyo, the black sun, still pulsing faintly within his arm, a defiant ember in the growing night. "It ceased to anchor itself," he said, his voice strained, "to solidify, to become permanent." He moved with a speed that defied his appearance, a blur of obsidian and shadow. He launched himself at the towering bloom, the elongated blade of Kuro-Taiyo erupting from his arm, not as a weapon, but as a conduit. The blade pierced the heart of the bloom, and a wave of violet lightning pulsed outward, not destroying the flower, but rewriting it, adding another layer of darkness to its already overwhelming stillness. As the violet light faded, the immense bloom shrunk, becoming a smaller, more manageable version of itself. But it was no longer just a flower. It was a seed, a promise of the abyss, planted firmly within Kano's heart. Hana watched, paralyzed with terror, as Kano turned back to her. The obsidian bloom on his arm pulsed with renewed intensity. The weight of the void, she realized, wasn't just his. It was now inextricably intertwined with hers. She was not just a witness, she was part of the process. Chapter 14. Echoes of the Seed. The rain hammered down, not with the relentless, stinging force of before, but with a ponderous, almost mournful rhythm. It wasn't obsidian, not entirely. The flakes were still black, saturated with a viscous, unsettling darkness, but threaded through them were fragments of iridescent violet, the lingering echo of the violet lightning, a ghostly stain on the already bruised sky. Hana remained frozen, a statue carved from despair and disbelief, the scent of ozone and something infinitely older, the smell of unfathomable nothing clinging to the air. Kano, his right arm a grotesque tapestry of obsidian scales, moved with a deliberate grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The Kuro-Taiyo, normally a weapon of brutal efficiency, now pulsed with a subdued, almost hypnotic light. It wasn't a burning darkness, but a slow, consuming cold, radiating outwards in concentric rings. He wasn't fighting the bloom, not in the conventional sense. He was nurturing it. It seeks to anchor itself, he repeated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, strained not by exertion, but by a profound, unsettling understanding. To solidify, to become permanent. His gaze, already pools of consuming black, seemed to delve deeper, as if he were peering into the nascent darkness residing within his own flesh. He advanced on the remaining bloom, a fist-sized orb of obsidian now, its petals delicately etched with patterns that resembled nothing of this world with an unnerving deliberation. It was as if he were conducting a macabre orchestra, the blade of Kuro-Taiyo, the conductor's baton, shaping the burgeoning darkness with terrifying precision. The violet lightning, instead of obliterating the bloom, flowed through it. It didn't burn, but rearranged, like a sculptor reshaping clay. Each pulse added another layer to the flower's structure, deepening its shadows, twisting its petals into increasingly complex, unnerving geometries. Hana felt a physical sickening in her stomach, a sensation of being rearranged on a fundamental level, as if her very perception was being folded and warped. As the violet light finally subsided, the bloom settled. It was smaller, certainly, perhaps a hand's breadth across, but it was no longer simply a flower. The violet hues had bled into the obsidian, creating swirling patterns of light and darkness within its core, suggesting an intelligence, a hunger that resonated with a horrifying familiarity. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of darkness. Kano stopped, his obsidian arm still outstretched, the blade of Kuro-Taiyo hovering millimeters from the bloom's surface. He didn't speak, didn't breathe. He simply listened. It was a listening that seemed to consume him, a complete surrender to the burgeoning darkness. Then, with agonizing slowness, he began to rotate his arm, not a violent, desperate movement, but a measured, deliberate turn, as if he were examining a newly formed wound. As he rotated, the bloom responded, its violet patterns intensifying, reaching out with tendrils of shadow that brushed against his skin. Hana watched, paralyzed, as the obsidian scales on his arm seemed to shift and reform, mirroring the bloom's unsettling geometry. "It remembers," Kano finally said, his voice a barely audible whisper, laced with a profound sadness. "It remembers what it was before. Before the severance." Hana didn't understand. Severance? What had been severed? She dared to move, a single, tentative step backward, but her feet seemed rooted to the mud. Kano's gaze shifted to her, and she felt a jolt, a searing connection that bypassed her senses and struck directly at her soul. It wasn't a look of judgment, or even of pity, but a profound, unbearable recognition. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a survivor of the daimyo's cruelty, but as something incomplete. "You are a fragment," he said, his voice a rasping echo within her mind, a shard of a forgotten void. You were taken, broken, and then contained. Like this. He gestured with his obsidian arm towards the bloom. The void does not merely consume. It reconstitutes. Suddenly, a searing pain shot through Hana's chest, as if 1,000 needles were piercing her flesh. She cried out, clutching at her breast, but the pain was not physical. It was a sensation of loss, of something vital being unraveled, replaced by the cold alien logic of the abyss. As the pain subsided, she looked down at her hand. On her palm, a single petal from the bloom black and shimmering with violet had adhered to her skin. It was no longer a flower petal. It was a seed. Kano turned to her, his eyes now completely devoid of any recognizable humanity. The black pits within them seemed to swirl, drawing her in, promising oblivion. The weight of the void, he whispered, is not just mine. It is now inextricably intertwined with yours. The obsidian rain intensified, converging around them in a swirling vortex, pulling everything the bloom, Kano, into its dizzying spiral. As the violet light returned, brighter and more potent than before, Hana realized with chilling clarity that she wasn't just a witness to the Abyss Walkers' dance with darkness. She was becoming part of it. Chapter 15. Echoes of Consumption. The obsidian rain hammered down with a relentless, almost sentient rhythm, a morbid percussion accompanying the deepening violet luminescence that choked the ravaged landscape. Hana stood motionless, a statue carved from disbelief and nascent horror, the single pulsing black petal clinging stubbornly to her palm. It throbbed with a cold internal light, a miniature echo of the void that consumed Kano. Kano, or what remained of him, was no longer a man. The obsidian scales had spread across his right arm like a creeping disease, a malignant blossoming of the abyss itself. The black steel of Kuro-Taiyo seemed to ripple beneath the scales, hungry and aware. He moved with a disconcerting grace, less a warrior and more a current, his eyes twin pools of unfathomable darkness. It is efficient, he murmured, his voice now a low, guttural hum, barely audible above the rain. The reconstitution, it accelerates. You are already becoming a vessel. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of command, but of observation. The petal on Hana's palm responded, unfurling slightly, its edges sharpening, taking on a faintly geometric form, a miniature, impossible fractal. It wasn't simply growing, it was assembling itself, mirroring the shifting chaos of the void. The initial severance was clumsy, Kano continued, a flicker of something almost akin to regret crossing his empty eyes. A crude expulsion. You were a wound, ripe for the taking. But now, the process is becoming refined. The void seeks not merely to extinguish, but to rebuild according to a logic beyond human comprehension. He took a step closer, the violet light intensifying around him, bathing Hana in a sickly glow. The air thickened, vibrating with a subtle, nauseating resonance. She felt a profound disorientation, a sense of being disassembled and reassembled simultaneously. Her memories, her emotions, her very sense of self were fraying at the edges, threatened by the encroaching cold. Tell me, Kano said, his voice a silken whisper that seemed to penetrate her very bones. What do you feel? Do you resist the pull? Or do you embrace the elegance of annihilation? Hana squeezed her hand, trying to grasp onto something solid, anything to anchor herself. The petal on her palm pulsed faster, a frantic, insistent rhythm. She could feel the cold seeping into her, not just from the rain, but from within. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was a lack, a profound, aching absence of warmth, of joy, of anything that defined her former life. I don't understand, she choked out, the words feeling alien on her tongue. It's not like dying. There's no darkness, no release, just nothingness, constantly trying to fill the space where something used to be. Kano tilted his head, a movement both alien and unsettlingly familiar. Precisely. Death is a collapse. The void is an expansion. It doesn't merely erase, it creates. He reached out a hand, the obsidian scales shimmering, and gently brushed against the petal on her palm. As his touch made contact, a jolt of pure, agonizing cold shot through her. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a psychic one. A cascading wave of information, of geometries and equations, of concepts utterly beyond her ability to grasp. Images flashed through her mind, landscapes of impossible angles, cities built of shadow and light, beings of pure energy dancing in the void. She saw the birth of stars and the death of galaxies, all compressed into a single, overwhelming moment of cosmic horror. When the sensation subsided, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath that didn't seem to fill her lungs. She looked down at her hand, and the petal was gone. In its place was a tiny, perfectly formed obsidian shard, mirroring the scales that now covered Kano's arm. "You feel the pattern," Kano observed, a hint of something akin to satisfaction in his voice. "The architecture of the void. It is beautiful, isn't it? A symphony of absence. But beauty, as you understand it, is merely a fleeting illusion. The true beauty of the void lies in its eternal, unchanging state, a perfect empty space where all possibilities exist, and none are realized." He rose to his feet, the obsidian rain swirling around him, feeding into the violet luminescence. The swirling vortex intensified, drawing in the fallen fragments of the fortress, the blackened earth, and, inexorably, Hana herself. "You were a nexus, Hana," he said, his voice growing stronger, imbued with a terrifying power. "A point of convergence for the energies of this world. Ah, now, you are becoming the conduit. Through you, the abyss will flow freely." He took a step forward, and as he did, his obsidian hand reached out, extending not towards her, but towards the swirling vortex itself. His fingers interlaced, and the violet light exploded outward, engulfing them both in a blinding, deafening wave of nothingness. Then, silence. Only the relentless rhythm of the obsidian rain remained, and the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the void.